everyone. Yes, I think for me, what came across, and of course both Pat and Karen have captured the essence of both the first film and the second film. So what I would like to add to that is that I think what came across is that you have to be true to yourself. You have to understand where you are, and in that understanding, come to like a fuller realization of yourself, you know, your culture, your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your background, all of those things come together to form you. And when we examine gender-based violence and domestic violence, you have to look at childhood, and we have to look at our culture in Guyana, and we have to look at those institutions, right, that sometimes perpetuate the discrimination against women and against many other different people, including homosexuals and lesbians, etc., because it springs from the same place, that intolerance, right? That you know, anything that is different has to be has to be struggled against, you know, has to be removed, has to be made to feel worthless, or, you know, whatever their situation is, that it's not important enough to warrant society's attention.
Good evening, everyone. First, let me congratulate the groups for hosting these two films. We need more of this in Guyana to enrich our lives. The two films were opposites and at the same time complementary. The first film talked about, the feminist movement. I remember the book Sisterhood is Powerful, and that was there around when feminism was being pushed. And it talked about women coming together to empower themselves, to understand their own identity, and to grow from strength to strength because there's a sisterhood. The second movie was sort of depressing but real, and it talked about the opposite, because we don't see women supporting other women. What was very stark in the second movie, I asked the question, but where are the family members? If I had a sister that was being abused by that, I as a man, why would I allow that? And what are the institutional forces that allow this to happen? Is it that the church reinforces this? Is this that the language of our culture, you know, bitch, and behind every great man there is a woman, not that she's at the side. Equality, again, the power difference. But for me, most of all, it was about stigma. In the first movie, it was the stigma of being female or black and being a lesbian. In the second one, it was the stigma of domestic abuse, which we don't stigmatize. We allow it in our society to occur. We actually embrace it. When somebody gets murdered, it's like, oh, it's just another murder. It's a societal issue, it's a holistic issue, and we're dealing with it in simplistic ways.
Thanks. I want to keep on that same theme about institutions. One of the themes I heard in particularly the second film was around faith institutions, religious institutions. One of the women talked about how in her church, a particular interpretation of the scripture seek to support male domination and male abuse of power over women. So my question, which anybody could pick up, is what is the role of religious institutions, in particular faith leaders, in dealing with this problem? Are they part of the problem? Are they part of the solution? Are they part of the problem? We need to make them part of the solution. Patricia? Reverend?
Okay, I think both. Well, speaking for the Christian community, because I'm a Christian pastor, I think that we still so much clothe ourselves with, well, not only that, but imbibe ourselves with this very colonial, well, not just colonial, very much we've signed up to this Christianity, very much a hegemonic, with that kind of paradigm of power that we saw pervasive throughout the two films. I think that interpretation of scripture, and we can be quite, we can be quite selective in relation to how we do this. I think one of the things mentioned in terms of our sense of identity, history, our rootedness, you know, that make us who we are, and coming from a whole legacy of colonialism, and in terms of the role of Christianity in that whole mission of supporting, you know, colonialism in terms of building slave societies. Even now, we have still, we still have quite a strong hold on that kind of power that would keep that kind of status quo. And so our interpretation of the Bible, in a lot of cases, would preserve this kind of relationship and this idea of power. And yes, we would read women submit, your wives submit to your husbands. We read also slaves submit to your masters. We read, you know, the story of the Canaanite woman who will take the bread of the children and throw it to dogs, and we will, you know, but yet we seem to have very selective ways of how we interpret and how we apply these for our living today. But yet, let me add that there has been a lot of, the Christian community has been moving forward in terms of this recognition. The World Council of Churches, they've had 10 years and more, or more than 10 years in terms of breaking the silence, in terms of not only in terms of how churches would partner with institutions in the society, but in terms of looking at the inside too, to recognize and to name that power, and also to theologically, you know, analyze this, and to be able to look for new ways of thinking, new kind of theologies of life. I think that also women have found some sources of strength always in the church, in terms of, I can give you a story, where in one of the churches, the Burns Presbyterian in Queenstown, a women's group, and they would have holidays in August when, you know, people go on holidays, so there's no group meeting. And I would see this car parked up, and this member of the group, he's there. And then I said, but the church is closed and the gate is closed. So one day I stopped and I said, you're waiting, something gonna happen here? And she said, no, this is our 1 hour of free time. She cannot go shopping by herself, she cannot do anything on her own, but she can come to church, and she can come to women's group. And so yes, churches have also been places of solace, places where women can gather, places where women can also express their emotions, and where they can kind of try to be themselves. So that's in terms of working towards part of the solution.
Well, you know, anybody who reads the newspapers, I mean, I heard Eric say, you know, if it was my sister. But how many, for this year, how many stories have you read where the family and the neighbors say, it had always used to be chill? And, you know, and sometimes she denies it, but we don't want to take the time to really offer support to make sure she understands what is at stake, to try to help her, steer her to some place where she could get help if we ourselves don't have the tools to help. And unfortunately, notwithstanding all the public work and the education that has been going on, notwithstanding the fact that the faith-based organizations are part of the semi-national plan. I don't know that we have a plan to address violence. Women still come in saying that the past to say. So the family, as important as it is still being erected as something more important than the safety of the women and the children in the family. So regardless of the dangers, regardless of the threat and the violence, she has to think about the family, she must think about the children mustn't grow up without a father. So it's that kind of wrong-headed message that is still being put out there. And I was hearing somebody behind me that was feeling this little film very seriously, because she was having none of it. He can knock me again and I'm going back again. No. But unfortunately, sometimes the response is not as easy as that, and we do have to find more and more support mechanisms and material support as well, not just the moral support, but the material support to help women to move out of these situations.
Church is part of the solution, but also is a significant part of the problem, just being honest. Always argued in the past few years that instead of saving souls, the church is busy saving wealth. But it's a broader issue. All the influencers in our society, whether it's the home, the church, the school, the media, we all seem to contribute to this sense that women are inferior. Our music, our language, almost every aspect of society tells women you deserve this, that you don't have any value. And that's what we're seeing there. When a man can believe he owns somebody, and he's afraid, or she's afraid to go to the shop alone, or she can't go to the movies, or she can't visit her friends. I mean, that's craziness. And yet, we keep not saying anything. We don't see any coalitions of women, we don't see any female leaders saying no to this. Leadership is important. Men are not going to solve this problem because they don't see it as a problem. And until women start recognizing that and start forming coalitions, in the United States, when there were issues in the black community, there was 100 black men were formed. Women have to start addressing this issue. The other thing too is that the church tells you thou shalt not kill. I have a Jamaican friend who looks at domestic violence very differently. She said, if he did that to me when he's sleeping, I'll put oil in his story.
Point I would like to make is that I know that we're talking about Guyana, and of course we have to be concerned about the levels of violence in Guyanese society, which over the years it's not going down. There are still as many women being killed every year in Guyana as 2-3 years ago. And the level of violence, even if it doesn't lead to death, is also the same, or it is increasing, because many people feel it's increasing. But when we look at the global picture, I know Eric talked about the United States of America, but when we look at the figures for the United States of America, they have similar figures to us. 1 in 3 women in United States of America also experiences domestic violence, right? Similar to our figures. And this is something that occurs in every single country in the world. So what is going on? It's not peculiar to Guyana. But in saying that, I'm not saying that we should not address it. But what is it that makes men all over the world, from all cultures, from all religions, from all ethnicities, poor, rich, whatever, feel they have the right to hit their partners, right? And it has to do with inequality and discrimination against women, and the feeling that we are inferior, that we are to be controlled. And I want to talk about control a bit, because at the root cause of domestic violence, the abuser, in fact, their greatest fear is that the person that they're trying to exert control over will leave them, right? That is one of their greatest fears. So, I don't know, it's just throughout the centuries, the dominant sex, which has traditionally been the male, has sought to control females, right? Their sexuality and female power. And anything that threatens that, leads to a reaction which very often is violence. You know, and it's something that we have to look at. And even though other countries are working at it, I still want to make the point that this is happening in every single country of the world, right? Be they powerful, be they the most powerful in the world, right? So it is a worldwide problem, and even with all the advances that technology, medicine, education, you call it, all the advances in that, still, in 2008, as the Red Thread film showed, 1 in 3 women worldwide are still experiencing domestic violence.
Yes, control, and yes, it is global. I think what we're feeling here is that there seems to be not the same kind of attention to the issue. There seem to be not the same level of resources put to the issue. But it is true that globally, women are not equal. So they might be arguing equality and inequality in slightly different terms, and we discuss it here, but that's the global capitalist reality. And we are part of this global capitalist world, which sees women as less, which sees women, and this is in spite of all equality laws that we have. So we still have to debate among some serious intellectual and progressive people, is the man the head of the home? Should the man be the head of the home? What does being the head of the home give you rights to? Those are still discussions that we're having. We're talking about ending violence against women, and there is no argument that there are very few people that would stand up in public and say that the woman got to get blows. There are some, but not many. But we are still debating whether children should get blows. Now, children are even more vulnerable than women. Adults have responsibilities to children. But in this culture that we live in, we still want to debate about should they get blows, how many blows should they get, how hard should the blows be, how big should the weapon be. It's a level of confusion and hypocrisy and all kinds of things. So women are beaten and women suffer violence because of inequality, because somebody wants to control them. The man wants to control them. Why do children get blows? Because adults want to control them. Because we believe that the way we exercise our individual power, going back to Audre Lorde, is to find somebody weaker to control. And that is the paradigm that we have to shift.
Leadership. Eric mentioned leadership, women's leadership, political leadership. Help and Shelter has a letter in the press today, and if you haven't read it yet, you should read it. And one of the things that they're calling for is the National Domestic Violence Oversight Committee and the Sexual Offences Task Force to be set up. I noticed too that the Red Thread film ended on the point in the text about calling for legal protections to be more effective. So my last question to the panel, before we get some contributions from the audience, in the Guyana context, is the gap in the response to gender-based violence, the lack of leadership and the lack of measures in policy and law, which we need, like these committees, like these multi-sectoral bodies, like effective implementation of laws or better laws. Your thoughts on that? Anyone?
I was at a meeting today, another national conversation, which is supposed to culminate in a strategic plan, a national plan to address interpersonal violence. I made the same point about children there, and I didn't think they were very interested. I really don't know how we could pretend to tackle the issue of violence against women if we're not prepared to tackle the issue of violence against children. And all the laws that we have, and we have some marvelous laws, are less than what, 25% implemented? Yeah, we don't like those laws. Those in power don't like those laws. They kind of slip by. They slip by without them realizing what was going on. And we had a lot of difficulty with the Sexual Offences Act because they didn't even bother to read it properly when it was in the Select Committee. So it's when it went to court for implementation that then problems were created and objections made to some of the provisions in that law. But it's I don't know, we don't, if we cannot think of children as human beings that need protection, that need guidance, that need to be free of violence, then we cannot seriously address any other form of violence. The other problem I think that we're facing in addressing this issue is that the public face of violence is the face of the poor. You don't find the professionals and the middle classes going to court to complain about violence or to apply for protection orders. They're a very small minority. And as small as Guyana is, we know that among our policymakers, we have some serious abusers. Do we really expect that without pressure, those abusers who have power are going to use that power for the protection of the persons who need it? I don't think so. The bottom line, though, is that Guyana, the constitution of this country, as well as the conventions that this country has signed on to, require that the state must exercise due diligence, not pass law, must exercise due diligence. In other words, just how the children must exercise due diligence when they're studying for exams, the state must exercise due diligence to ensure the protection of women and children and the vulnerable in this country. And I don't think by any measure, by any stretch, that anybody can claim that due diligence is being exercised. Not at the level of the social sector, not at the level of the courts, not at the level of the law enforcement people. It's not serious, and we have a lot more work. When I say we, I don't mean them down by Brickdown. I mean we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, I fully support everything Karen has said, because the truth is that, you see, this whole issue of gender-based violence and domestic violence, right? It really causes us, if we want to address it, we have to tackle relationships and the kind of relationships that we have between men and women. And a lot of people like to talk about, oh, domestic violence and this issue and that issue, right? As something apart from them. But this is something in all of our relationships. Relationships, right? At the core of it, some of them are, there is violence and there is abuse taking place, right? But it is something that causes great fear to people. And something that as a society, and I would say the whole world up to now, is unable to confront and tackle, right? The way we socialize our children, the way we socialize ourselves, and so on. This perpetuates this whole cycle of violence. which is just, is making the society, malformed, etc. And I just want to say a little thing which I heard recently, and that is in talking about relationships between men and women. And this is what they said, that men generally, and this is putting it simply, men are afraid that women are going to laugh at them, right? That's their fear. That women will mock them and so on. Whereas women, their fear is that men are going to kill them. That's their partner. And that is the difference. Because when we talk about domestic violence and gender-based violence, and when men say, but we are also abused, and we recognize they are abused, it is that kind of level of abuse that we're talking about. I'm afraid that I'm going to be laughed at or insulted or whatever. But for the woman, it's her life at risk very often. And I'm sure if I asked women sitting in this audience who have been in relationships, right, they will say that that has crossed their mind. I'm not sure if there are any here where it has not crossed their mind at some point.
In terms of how we think of issues and how we organize education in the schools, is that we separate things into separate little pockets. And one of the big failures, I would say, in the education system is the ways in which sexuality is addressed or not addressed. So this is a big no-no. And the whole business of sexuality education is separate, usually, from the discussion of violence. And that in itself is a violence. Because if we are all sexual human beings, across whatever spectrum of sexuality, then if we're not comfortable with that, if we don't understand it, if we're not encouraged to celebrate our sexuality, then essentially a violence is being done to each one of us. And we can't relate to ourselves, much less to somebody else. So for me, this discussion about violence also can be disconnected from sexuality. So, we could have a little subject over there called sexual or reproductive health, and we have another little one over there called HIV education, and another little one over there called violence or non-violence. But they're not disconnected. And we have to understand the ways in which, from the beginning, what is happening is that a violence is being done to who we are. So we end up with it as adults who don't understand ourselves, who have no confidence in ourselves, who can't relate in a human way to anybody else. And that's the most serious gap that we have to address as well.
Yeah, on the issue of leadership, I still believe that that's the missing issue. When we had HIV and AIDS, it was declared a pandemic. All sorts of monies came into the country. There were about 60-something NGOs. As much as this is a pandemic, no one has called it a pandemic. We fancy put around it. I think some group, and the government is not going to do it because there's no benefit in them solving this problem, some group has to stand up and be counted, has to start redefining it. It's not about sexuality, it's not about females, it's about rights. And unless we start defining it in the context of rights, we're going to miss the boat and we're going to be segmented. So we need to be showing that film every day. We need to take drastic steps. And it comes back to leadership. If you were to see that second movie every day, and if we were to start stigmatizing the abusers instead of stigmatizing those being abused, we would have a different picture.
I think, yes, certainly in relation to leadership, I don't know what, I didn't even know there was a conference on like the national strategy, is that it? Yes. I think that we are seeing this very clearly. I mean, take for instance even the Act from 1996 to now, what mechanisms have really been put in place for the implementation. That workshop that we were involved in 2 years ago or a year ago with magistrates, 2011, that's 2 years ago. I mean, most of the magistrates didn't even read the act. You're talking about 1996 to now. Who cares? I mean, that's the whole thing. Who cares? Do people really care about this in terms of even vision? I don't know if there's any kind of caring for people who suffer this. I mean, there's some rhetoric. I don't know much about a national plan, because in terms of supporting the work so far, whenever you hear about these stories in the newspapers and public, people are calling on Wretch rather than Help and Shelter. I hope you're getting paid some money to do this work. But I mean, what kind of investment is there? I mean, both in terms of all kinds of resources, in terms of recognizing the kind of epidemic that we have here in Guyana. Yes, we have it throughout the world, but we are talking about, here in Guyana, where we see not to be able to. I think sometimes the society is numb. I don't know where else though. I think there are a few other places. I don't know how many places you see this so openly done. We were having a youth workshop in one of my churches on this, and one of the young persons, she was saying, she works with forestry, and they heard this noise at about 9 o'clock and looked through the window, and there was a young man battering a young woman, bottles, and so, he broke bottles, he was battering, and people were looking, they just stood there looking. And I said, what did you all do? And she said, well, they were looking, and then they ran downstairs, somebody ran downstairs, opened the door, and got a woman to come in. And later, the man's mother, who works nearby, she came over to abuse up the woman. That is because of her, this guy had to be behaving like this on the street. I'm saying that, I mean, it's everywhere, but I don't know where we have this being done so openly. And I'm sure each one of us, I've seen it on the street, I'm sure that each one of us, we've had this experience. And we've heard stories about neighbors even testifying that they've heard these, screams of anguish. We've read about that, and yet would not come out to do anything for fear of their lives, and whatever reason, or it's a private matter. I mean, we have to say, what is it happening here in Guyana? Are we losing our sense of humanity?